Ladies and gentlemen, Robin Spence is going to introduce Dr. Alex Reid. He's going to talk, Dr. Reid is going to speak for about an hour, and then we've got about 3/4 of an hour of discussion. So Robin, you will do the introduction.
Thank you very much. Reid has very kindly agreed to be chairman this evening, and I'm very pleased that Dr. Alex Reid has agreed to come and talk to us this evening. I'll just read out some of his many achievements, and he has a very interesting history. We were architecture students together at Cambridge University, and I think that if he had stuck in architecture, he would have been one of the leading architects in this country today. I don't think that's any exaggeration. He was an extremely talented, gifted architect at Cambridge University. Since then, he graduated at Cambridge University at the same time as Robin and I did in 1962. Since then, he spent 5 years as a helicopter pilot in the Fleet Aero from 1962 to 1967. From 1967 to 1969, he studied architecture and planning at University College, at the Bartlett School of Architecture. Correct me if I'm wrong. From 1969 to 1972, he started and ran a communications study group, which is part of the University College of London, and the object of that was to study the social and economic impact of telecommunications. In 1972, he went into the GPO and became head of long-range studies, and from 72 to 77. From 77 to 1980, he was director of Prestel, and from 1980, chief executive of British Telecom Spectrum. Is that correct, Alex? So, with that will give you a little background of how Dr. Alex Reid started as an architect and moved into telecommunications. And
well, thank you very much, Robin, for that kind introduction. I'm sure that if you'd gone into telecoms, Robin, you'd be one of the leading telecommunicators in the country today. Well, I brought along some various bits of kit here, some of which are kind of static demonstrations, mainly because I dropped one of them getting out of the taxi, and so it doesn't work. But one of them did just work on test, so I thought I'd just give you another demonstration of it to start the proceedings, and then I'll be able to relax, because otherwise if I do it later I shall worry all the time about whether it's going to work. It's this thing here, which I thought you might find rather intriguing. It's a telephone of the kind that we supply in vehicles, but it's portable and it has its own battery. And it communicates with the post office tower direct by radio, and thence into the British telephone network, and thence into the, if you wish, into the international telephone network. So what I was going to try and do is to make a call to the United States using this thing, and if I'm lucky it'll all work. So what I do is I switch it on, and tell them that I'm in the London area, and I should get the radio telephone operator in a few minutes. Good evening. This is mobile 15251. I'd like to make a service call to the United States, please.
107 mobile. Oh, hold on.
So we now have to the international operator, which may take a moment or two. This is mobile 15251. I'd like to make a call to the United States, please.
Yes, could you just slowly repeat your number?
Mobile 15251.
15251. Okay, and the number in the States, please?
Area code 312,
312.
and the number is 5766031.
5766031. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, hold the line, sir, please. Do you want me to tell them in the States that you're calling from a mobile?
Well, yes, please. That'd be a good idea.
Yes.
Hello? I think we've got a tone there,
Okay,
haven't we?
pick up, please.
Hello?
Hello?
Is that Nobby Clark?
Yes, it is.
Hello, Nobby. It's good to hear from you. It's Alex Reid here.
Yes, sir.
Well, I wonder if you'd like to tell us what's happening in Chicago today, please.
Yes, Chicago today is somewhat overcast. I think we had a little less sun than London, and the temperature is about 23 degrees Fahrenheit.
And what are you going to do for Christmas?
Well, we're going to have a relatively quiet time. I have two daughters in this general area, so we'll have a little family get-together.
Well, thank you very much, Nobby. I don't want to take up your time, but it served to demonstrate the system works okay. I'm most grateful. Many thanks.
You're very welcome, sir, and anytime it's a pleasure.
All the best. Good night. Okay. Well, now I can relax. That's all, actually. No, it's all absolutely genuine. Well, I'll come back to describe some of the things that go on there in a little more detail later, but I just wanted to bring something along as an illustration of the kinds of things one can now do with the telephone system. Well, I'm in the business of electronic communications, and when Robin invited me to speak, he mentioned that the theme of these talks was a theme of quality. And I wrestled with that theme for quite a while. And I'm afraid I was completely stumped, and perhaps it's a kind of comment on telecommunications that it's very difficult to build a discussion around the concept of quality in telecommunications. A bit like sort of quality in electricity, or you know, it's kind of, it's a utility, mechanical kind of a thing, where, I mean, there's a crude sense of quality in whether you can hear the other guy or you can't hear the other guy, but provided the machine does what you want to do, it's difficult to see where quality lies beyond that. So I'm afraid that I didn't find that the theme of quality struck a light. I thought I might wittily offer you a second best of adopting a theme of something else that began with the letter Q, like quangos or quantities or quartets or quibbles or qualifications or the quintessence of the subject. But as I was lying in bed last night thinking of all the words I could think of that began with Q, they didn't kind of strike much of a light either. So I'm afraid I've abandoned the quality as a theme and also the letter Q as a theme, and I'm just going to ramble all over the alphabet. Well, what I wanted to say something about was electronic communications, and in particular what kind of impact it might have on architecture and planning. So starting with electronic communications, I think it's best to consider what we can do in telecoms as falling into four categories concerned with the kind of message that one's transmitting. And the four main kinds of message we deal with are voice messages, data messages, graphics messages, and visual messages. Voice, telephone, radio, kind of thing we've just been doing. Data, the sort of communication between computers sending letters or numbers for computer processing at each end. By graphic communication, I mean things like facsimile transmission, where you can send an image of a document over a distance by encoding it and sending it down a telephone line. Or there are systems now that send still television pictures from one place to another, storing them at each end. And then by vision, I mean the full moving television that you get in broadcast television or in two-way television systems used for meetings at a distance or for the picture telephone. So the facilities that telecoms can offer in the future have, I think, really to be thought about in those different categories, because the opportunities, the costs, the technical problems are very different depending on which of those four categories you're dealing with. We're in the business then of transporting those kind of things around. Now, how does one do it in a telecom system? There are five main elements of a telecom system which apply to any of those four types of message that one might be handling. The first element is what you might call the transducers. By that I mean the devices that convert signals from one form or one human sense into a different one. And in particular, the sort of transducers we deal with in telecoms are those that transfer signals of sound or light, or in some cases touch, into electrical signals, and vice versa, back from electrical signals into sound and light and touch. So that the ordinary telephone instrument is an example of a transducer, because it's taking the variations in air pressure created by the mouth and converting them into electrical signals to go down the line. And similarly, in the earpiece, it's converting electrical signals back into air pressure so that you can hear the person at the other end. Transducers are really very important because we deal entirely in electrical signals. Humans can't really handle electrical signals at all, although we have electrical signals rushing around in our brains. We don't use them in a practical sense. We use the senses of sight and sound and touch. And so if one's going to adapt this technology to human use, the development of effective and economical transducers is really vital. And I've got one or two examples here of transducers to illustrate my point. This is it happens to be the controller of a Prestel adapter, but it equally could be the remote channel control of a TV set. And what it does is to transduce tactile signals on these buttons into infrared signals that come out of the front, which are then received by the television set or the Prestel set. So that's an example of a simple transducer. Another example we have here is something called an acoustic coupler. And it is quite interesting because this enables you to send data over the telephone network. And what you do is you take the telephone's got the map, but you take the telephone handset and you stick it in here. You dial up the computer and you then stick the handset in there and strap it down. And it then listens to what's coming out of the earpiece, and the machine speaks into the mouthpiece. So that what it does is, in use, you're connected through to a computer. The computer sends whistles down the line, which are encoded data, and they are then heard by a microphone in this black box, which converts them back into electrical signals to operate on the terminal, and to send signals down, it sends them back into the earpiece. So that this is a kind of sort of robotic mouth and ear, which, when married up with the ordinary telephone handset, thanks very much, will transduce the signals back into electrical form of a kind that a computer can deal with. Well, here we have another example of I suppose this is really getting into storage and processing, but let me show you while we're at it. This is a Prestel adapter. And what this does is to convert an ordinary television set into a computer display, because you can plug it at the back here. I mean, the significant thing about it is it has two leads coming out of the back. One, the power lead and ordinary mains lead here, and the other is the telephone lead, and you stick this into a telephone jack socket, and then this will actually accept data signals down the telephone network, and you have a wire coming from this into a TV set, and it will then convert those into visual displays on the TV. But that actually does involve a considerable signal processing, so it rather goes beyond the simple transducer. And of course this machine has the transducer from my voice into the electrical signals and then into another form of electrical signals at the post office time. So that one category of kit that we're dealing with are these transducers, which are typically pieces of equipment that sit at the end of the telephone network that interface with the human. Second category is the transmission systems. These are the means of sending streams of electrical information from A to B. The main means of those in use today are ordinary wires, twisted pairs of wires, like one's telephone wire. But there have been tremendous strides in transmission, and a lot of use is nowadays made of microwave point-to-point radio links, the dishes you see on the post office tower pointing to the Birmingham Tower and then on up the country. There are also much higher capacity cables used, known as coaxial cables, which is this kind of a cable that has a central conductor with an outer sheath, and you can send thousands of telephone conversations down one of those. And also we're now starting to use in the telephone network hair-thin optical fibers, which you send signals down in the form of laser light. And in that way you can send tens of thousands of telephone conversations down a single fiber of glass no thicker than a human hair. There's also, of course, international cables going under the sea, and indeed an increasing number of satellites being used both for international communication and domestic communication within continents. So there's been very great strides in transmission systems, but the simple purpose of a transmission system is it's just kind of in-out thing. It's just conquering distance by sending a signal from point A to point B. That's all it does. The third element, which is the area in which the greatest investment is, in fact, in telephone systems, is the switching element. Because if you have, as we do in this country, 30 million telephones, it's really a quite mind-boggling problem to connect any one of those to any other on demand. And this is achieved through a very complex hierarchy of nodes of local telephone exchanges, junction telephone exchanges, and trunk telephone exchanges, all of which are capable of making cross connections in order to establish a continuous path through from the one speaker to the other speaker. In fact, the bulk of that switching equipment today is electromechanical. It is the contacts are achieved literally by mechanical levers and cogs cranking round and making mechanical copper-to-copper contact across the country in order that you can speak to your mother-in-law. And that is a really mind-boggling piece of technology, because you'll appreciate in any mechanical device there's a finite chance of failure. So when you add up a long chain of such devices, it's rather like the lights on the Christmas tree, that if one of them goes out, the thing goes dead. And it's frankly a miracle that, I mean, people complain about the telephone system and the noise and misdialed numbers and crossed wires and so on, but I mean, my line is that it's really an absolute miracle that the thing works at all, because it's, you know, it's like a house flying, you know, it's just really contrary to the technology that it should work at all. So the switching, it plays an absolutely vital part in making the cross connections between the transmission links. And that again is an area where great strides are occurring, because modern switches are completely electronic. They are solid state microelectronic systems which don't involve moving parts at all. The fourth kind of element we deal with are storage elements, where you have electronic memory that can actually store data in order for later retrieval. And that is an aspect that's of particular importance in the handling of data, and modern telecom systems do involve considerable storage of data on either magnetic disks, which are rather like gramophone records revolving at great speed. Typical magnetic disk, about 12 inches square and 2 or 3 inches thick, can hold maybe 300 million bytes of data, where a byte is 8 bits of data. So a character of the alphabet would typically be a byte, so that you could hold, say, 300 million characters of the alphabet on one of these disks. There are other, even more powerful storage methods coming along, like the video disk, which can be used not just to store movies, but also to store enormous volumes of text and numbers. Then the fifth element in any sort of electronic communication system is a processing element, which is really the kind of thing computers do, large or small, of taking in data and then manipulating it in order to perform transformations, sorting, filing, calculations upon it in order to bring it out in some other form. And this Prestel adapter has quite a powerful processing activity because it is just receiving a stream of in effect, dots and dashes from the telephone line, and it has within it, for example, in its memory, a knowledge of the shapes of all the letters of the alphabet, so that when it gets a stream of dots and dashes corresponding to a capital letter A, it feeds into the television set a quite different pattern of dots and dashes of a kind that will create the letter A on the screen as the raster scan whips across the television screen. So that there is quite a complex calculating and conversion process going on inside a machine like that. In a big computer, of course, it's immensely more complex. Well, the kinds of message we deal with then are voice, data, graphic, and vision. The elements of the systems that handle them are the transducers, the transmission, the switching, the storage, and the processing. But I think a point I must make that may not be familiar to you all is that different kinds of messages involve enormously different rates of data transmission. If we could take the example of my radio pager here, I'm sorry, perhaps I should have mentioned this. This is a sort of bleeper thing that we run all over the country. We have about 70,000 of these out with customers who rent them from us, and it's completely automatic. If somebody wants to alert me, they dial a particular number into the telephone system, which can be done anywhere in the country, and within about 30 seconds, this thing goes off like that. And again, this I think is quite a remarkable bit of technology. It has inside it not just a battery and a microprocessor, but it has a radio receiver. And it is listening all the time that I have it switched on day and night, and what it is hearing in effect, is a constant stream of 10-digit numbers broadcast from 30 or 40 transmitters all over the country. And it knows its own number, and every number that comes by, and they come by about 5 a second, it reads the number, and it compares it with its own number, and it says, no, it's not for me. And it's kind of, you'd think it'd be kind of dispiriting, because with 70,000 subscribers, of course, its own number doesn't come up very often, but it hangs in there listening. It hasn't given up yet. And when its number comes by, off it goes and bleeps. It matches it up and says, yes, that's me, and it bleeps. Now, the interesting feature of this device is that it is really just sending me a binary signal of it either says I'm bleeping or I'm not bleeping. So that it's in binary arithmetic, it's just one bit of information. It's actually, strictly speaking, 2 bits, because it can either give a steady bleep or an intermittent bleep, which signals to you to call back either of 2 telephone numbers. But the amount of information that conveys to me is absolutely tiny. And yet, it's very valuable information, because that bleep means something to me. It's not just like the crack of a creak of a branch in a tree. It's a bleep, it's a signal which, although very small in information terms, is heavily laden with connotations for me, namely that I ought to ring my secretary or what have you. And therefore, just that one little bit of information is valuable to me. And in fact, our customers pay something like 50 pence per bit of information, if you look at the average that they use these in a year. Now, if we go to the other extreme of a television set, a television signal sends about 5 million bits of information per second. In order just to watch the news at 10, you have to send down that cable into the back of the TV from the roof aerial, 5 million bits of information per second. because that screen is being refreshed 50 times a second, and there are hundreds of thousands of little dots on that screen, each of which could be of varying brightness or color. And so the amount of information needed to operate a TV set and produce a TV picture is absolutely tremendous. Now, what is fortunate, of course, is that, or I don't know, it's not fortunate exactly, but a consequence of that is that everybody pretty well has to watch the same TV picture at the same time if they're going to watch it live, because the amount of radio space available to transmit those signals, if you have 3, 4, 5 television channels, you have soaked up all the radio frequencies possible to use for TV. And you then, if you want more channels, have to resort to cable television, where you can start to pump in yet greater capacity. But when people say, oh, well, why aren't we all sitting at our desks communicating with each other by picture telephone, of seeing a moving picture of the other guy when you're talking? The reason is that these moving pictures do require the transmission of the most tremendous volumes of information. If it's a simple broadcast system like the BBC, that's no great problem, because the technology of broadcasting lends itself to the blasting out of a vast splurge of information over the whole country. But if you want to do it on a selective basis, if, for example, 30 million people each wanted, as in the phone, to be able to call each other and talk to each other on moving television pictures, you would need to have a massively more expensive system than we have today. It could be done, but the telephone system represents a value of about £12,000 million today. If you wanted a similar system to carry pictures as well as voice, you'd probably be talking perhaps 10 times that amount. So between those two extremes of the radio pager with just its one bit of information per hour maybe, through to the television set with 5 million bits of information per second, there's a tremendous spectrum in the amount of information that needs to be transmitted to produce the desired result. And there are intermediate steps. For example, a telephone conversation, such as we were having here, uses about 64,000 bits of information per second. And when we would probably have gone across the satellite there to Chicago, and that would be sent in a digital form over the satellite at 64,000 bits of information per second, which of course is a lot more than the radio pager, but still a lot less than the 5 million bits per second of the TV. Data is considerably more economical than voice. The Prestel service, which shows 960 characters of numbers or letters on the TV screen, that requires about 1,200 bits per second down the telephone line to fill that TV screen. And the reason it can be done so much more economically than the television picture is that there is a very considerable element of predictability in putting up letters or numbers. There's only a limited number of characters in the alphabet and a limited number of numbers. So that what you do, as I mentioned earlier, is you store within your machine here the shapes of the 26 letters of the alphabet and the numbers. And then each of those needs to be just coded, given a kind of Morse code designation of a few bits. And then all you need to send from the Prestel computers are those codes, and the machine here will generate within it the shapes of the letters and numbers to go up on the screen. Perhaps I should, just coming back, if I may, to voice for a second, explain how we get from somebody's spoken conversation to the 64,000 bits of information flowing across that satellite, because I think it is quite interesting. When you are speaking, what you produce is a varying pressure in the air from your speech. And you can plot that. I mean, you could, if you did a plot of pressure against time, and you had it over, say, 100th of a second, you would see a curve like this, which you sometimes see on oscilloscopes, which is the pattern over time of the varying pressure produced by speech. Now, the way we digitize speech in order to send it over these modern transmission systems is that we slice it into little slices, and we inspect the height of that curve about 8,000 times a second. And in practice, you don't need to measure the height of the curve in absolute terms. You have certain categories of, say, 10 steps. You would say that if this is the base, that there could be maybe 10 possible heights of the curve. And so the system, the transmission system in the telephone exchange looks at your particular speech being produced down the line, and it says, oh yes, at this moment in time, the speech level, the pressure level is at that point in that category 3. It then looks again an 8,000th of a second later and sees what the level is, and it carries on that 8,000 times a second. And then it encodes those levels in digital codes and sends those codes down to the far end, so that at the far end it can be reproduced, and that continuous or virtually continuous curve can be reconstructed. So that it's kind of dismantling of a continuous curve into discrete codes and a reconstruction of it. But what is, I think, really rather remarkable and illustrates the power of this technology is that if you had a quite common or garden conversation across the telephone, maybe across the other side of London, it's very likely that your conversation would use a system of what we call time division multiplex, which means that on a single pair of wires, some 30 conversations can be interleaved with each other in time. Because I mentioned that you need to measure the speech pressure about 8,000 times a second. Now that sounds fantastically fast, but in fact computers can work much faster than that. And the computer in the telephone exchange is capable, having checked what your pressure of speech is, it has time to go and check the next conversation, what they're up to, and indeed 28 other conversations, and record all of those pressures, and then come back to you an 8,000th of a second later and measure yours again. So that if you were to inspect the signals flowing down that single pair of wires, what you would see would be, put it under a microscope so to speak, is that you would see 30 different conversations that had been, small samples had been taken of each of these 30, and they've been interleaved. And then at the far end, it all has to be locked together very precisely in time, of course, but at the far end, the receiving end of the transmission system, it is plucking out the Spence, that slice from the Spence conversation, and shooting it down that pair of wires, and then it's almost like a dealer dealing cards, deals the little bits of the conversation down these 30 different lines, and to the human ear, the gaps are closed and it sounds like continuous speech. So once you get communication into these digitally coded forms, you can perform the most extraordinary tricks with it. Another example perhaps I ought to mention in visual communication is I said that a television picture requires about 5 million bits of information per second. People are working very hard to try to reduce that because it's clearly very expensive to transmit that sort of amount. And one of the ways that this is done is by taking advantage of redundancy within the signal. I mean, to take a very simple example, if you had, I mentioned the news at 10, if you watched for 5 minutes the newsreader reading the news at 10, his face and mouth would move a certain amount, but the background studio would remain perhaps completely static for 5 minutes. And so a conventional TV signal is doing something really incredibly inefficient. It's 50 times a second sending the same crack on the wall 50 times a second for 5 minutes. Exactly the same information being repeated, repeated, and repeated, and repeated, and so it continues to appear on your TV screen. One of the things that's now done with, in research for picture telephone is within a computer at the sending end, a comparison of successive frames of the TV picture, and you send only the difference. So that basically what you do is you send, so to speak, a snapshot of the guy head and shoulders against the background. Then, storing that snapshot in the memory at the transmitting point, you take the next photograph a 50th of a second later, lay the two over each other, and see what differences there are, and simply send down the line where any differences have occurred. And so if for example, he moves his head, if his skin color is fairly constant, the actual area in the center of his cheek doesn't change at all, but the edge of his face would change. And in that way you can achieve increases of efficiency of 10 or 100 times because of the considerable kind of repetition in visual pictures of that sort. Well, I think I mean, having talked about the fundamentals of what these systems can do, I think what I'd like to do now, May, is just to go through some slides showing some practical examples of some of the things that the technology does. I don't know, Robin, how do we switch this one on?
The light. Just do it.
The controller's over here, is it?
Oh, yes, thanks. I've just got to do these lights here.
Well, I just brought along some photos of examples of the kind of systems that we deal with, just to bring it down to earth a bit. This is a slightly ancient telex machine which sends text information over the telephone network in alphabetic form. That is the technology really of the 60s or early 70s. A few months ago we introduced a
Technology.
yeah, we explain it well. Yeah, thanks. A few months ago we introduced this, which is our latest telex machine, the Puma, and it performs all the same functions, but it's much smaller, quieter, neater, and uses essentially electronic technology rather than the electromechanical technology of the previous machine. This is the next step in telex machines, which we'll be putting out in a few months' time. It still works to the telex network, but it has a little visual display there, which means that the operator can compose and edit messages before sending them over the telex network, which is a considerable advantage in terms of correcting errors or editing stuff before it goes out. And it's starting really to look very much like a small computer or word processor. This is our Prestel service. I don't know if yeah. I'm not sure whether I'm doing it very well. Yes, I think perhaps better manual, thanks. We've got about 15,000 Prestel sets out in the UK now, and they are all adapted television sets which connect to the telephone network, in which there are about half a dozen Prestel computers, each storing a couple of 100,000 pages of information. And the user simply pushes some buttons on a small keypad like that one I was showing you and calls up the particular page of his choice onto the screen of the Prestel set. This one's in travel agent. That's a, sorry, it seemed to jump back there, didn't we? Thanks. That's a sort of business Prestel set, 7-inch black and white screen made by STC, suitable for use on the desktop. And this is a Prestel adapter sitting on top of a TV set, which is the kind of thing I have on the table. And it plugs into a completely ordinary TV set and plugs in turn into the telephone network. That's the display capability of Prestel. It has 40 characters across and 24 rows, which can be in any combination of those 7 colors. It can also operate in what we call the graphics mode by painting solid areas of color onto the screen like that. And in that way it's possible to build up pages of information, of which I've got a few examples here. This is a British Rail railway timetable. A prayer for, a Bible reading from the Bible Society. I should explain that when we launched Prestel in 1978, we adopted what we call a common carrier policy of allowing anybody who wanted to publish information on Prestel to do so, provided they paid us to rent the space and provided they didn't break the law. And this produced a fascinating variety of publishing activities. Airline flights from Qantas. This is a poem in a poetry competition that was run where the words actually run from top to bottom. Sort of Christmas poem, I think. The Consumers Association put up several thousand pages of product reports. This one's about electric kettles. Theatre guides with theatre reviews. A number of firms use Prestel to publish information about their products. It's very simple to use. You just have the 10 buttons on the keypad, and on every page there are instructions what to do next. So if you want to read about short-term typewriter rentals from IBM, you just press button 3 on the keypad, and the next page comes up with information about that. So you don't need any computer knowledge.
How would you have got to IBM in the first place?
Well, one of two ways. There are printed directories, and you could look up IBM in the directory, and there'd be a number against it, like a phone number, and you can jump straight to that number if you wish. As well as the 10 numbers on the pad, there's a star button and a square button. And if you do star, a page number, and a square, you jump to the page number. The other way is that all of the pages are indexed from the front page by this sort of menu selection, as we call it. So I'm afraid I don't have a slide of it here, but if you go to when you enter Prestel, there is a general index that says, do you want information, home information, business information, travel, sports information, what have you. You press the button, and then it goes down in successively finer categories, and you would get to IBM in perhaps 30 seconds by that method. The central computers keep a track of the charges that you've incurred all the time, so that you can look at your bill at any stage. And the bill comprises a local phone call, but also a computer usage charge, which is what we call the time charge. So on this current call, the time charge is £1.11. And also a frame charge, and this is quite interesting because we allow the information providers to charge, if they wish, for their pages of information, which creates a kind of marketplace in information. IBM, because they're advertising, have got a 0p, that's a free page. But I think if we were to step back, for example, to the theatre guide here, that's 1p. So that anybody looking at that page, the computer records that that customer has incurred 1p and debits the customer's meter by 1p and credits the information provider's meter accordingly. So one of our functions that we perform in Prestel is a billing and money transfer.
I presume you don't know whether it's going to charge until the thing comes up. You can't get rid of it.
Well, there's a code of practice about price warning that gives you, I mean, if the price is going to change, you see if we go down here, more comedies, press square, 1p. Other plays, 0p. So that you should get a price warning before you go to the page.
No negotiation.
Sorry?
No negotiation.
No, I'm afraid not. No, take it or leave. So that was the IBM example. The other thing that Prestel can do, yes, this is the post office joke. There's a variety of jokes on the system.
You have to pay a fee for it.
Yes, well, it's not published by the post office, but it's about the post office, and there are various. The jokes are organised into categories. Press square for 2 Irish jokes. It's quite. I find it quite an amusing joke actually. Perhaps we should just pause. Well, is that legible from that?
Yes.
Well, you'll get the general feeling. Scan done. Now, the other thing about Prestel I ought to mention is that it's a two-way system. Every time you request a page, you are sending a signal through the telephone network to the central computer. And so the system can be used for sending messages of various kinds back from the user to the central computers and hence to the information providers. And this is an example of what we call the response page being used to book theatre seats. And there is real live booking of theatre and aircraft tickets and so on available on Prestel at present. It's like a little reply coupon here, and when you press the button on your keypad, it will fill in date, August, then if you put in 2 forward, it would print there 24, then you would press the square to carry on, and so on. So you can book things and buy things of various kinds. Well, press that. This is ordering wine in a similar fashion. And then I think I have a selection of a few greetings cards which you can send from one user to another about press stuff.
You design your own sort of images.
Well, no, this is it's all, as I mentioned, a common carrier philosophy that we run the system, but we have left to the world at large the opportunity to create and sell or purvey whatever information they want over it. So that the these things have been put together by information providers who do their own thing. Perhaps I should just pause on this one to explain that the graphics, because we're limited to 1200 bits a second of transmission, and the cost of the set is, because that's constrained, the storage in the set is limited. The graphics is all in the form of a little sort of needlework kind of approach of little squares, which can be in any one of the colours. So you can't do curved lines or circles. Okay, well, some other machines. This is a typical facsimile machine which enables you to transmit A4 documents over the telephone network. That machine takes about 3 minutes, but there are more modern machines now that will do it in about 40 seconds over an ordinary telephone line. This is something called Teletext, which is the successor to Telex, which is being launched in Germany and Sweden and Britain next year. What it does is to produce documents at the far end that are of electric typewriter quality. So that if you had somebody with an operation in London and one in Hong Kong, say, they could send a typed letter or document which would come out at the far end with all the upper and lower case paragraph indentations, tabulations and so on, exactly as if it was typed on an electric typewriter, rather than the kind of crude print you get on a telex machine. It can also handle paper either in the vertical or the horizontal format, and indeed will actually be cheaper than telex in transmission terms because it operates over the telephone network, which is cheaper. Again, it has a screen for composing and editing the messages. That's a Siemens machine. That's another view of the Siemens machine, a Siemens teletext machine. And this is a Philips teletext machine, which slightly different design but does the same job. Another shot of the Philips teletext machine. These are some radio pages. The one that I had on the table is this one here. And this is our latest one, which is even smaller. It's not much bigger than a box of matches, but it does exactly the same job, works virtually all over the country. This is my last slide, but I thought worth mentioning that we've recently opened a data communication service called the Packet Switching Service. But the interesting feature of packet switching is that instead of establishing a permanent circuit between 2 points, if you want to make a telephone call from Edinburgh to Bristol, you dial up the number in Bristol, and the system then dedicates a channel all the way through to Bristol for the duration of your call. Now, that is unsatisfactory for computer communications in 2 ways. One is that communications by computer tends to be rather intermittent. If you're sitting at a terminal, you may press a few keys and then pause for 2 or 3 minutes while you do something else before pressing any more keys. And it's rather expensive and inefficient to be occupying a line with nothing going down it for 2 or 3 minutes. The other aspect that's unsatisfactory of using the telephone network, which is used enormously today, about 100,000 terminals connected to it in the UK, but the other unsatisfactory feature is that you may need to send sudden lumps of data very quickly if you want to pull a whole document out from a central computer or a program, and the capacity of the telephone lines are rather limited. Well, what packet switching does is to lay in high-speed permanent links between these main centres, and then a user in Edinburgh calls up his local node here and tells the packet switching network that he wants to be connected to this person in Bristol. What he then does is he does fully occupy the link between his own office and the Edinburgh switch, and similarly that little distribution link is fully occupied. But this main high-speed bearer is shared between all the different conversations, rather like that time division multiplex I was speaking of, that the information is sent in packets, as we call it, each of which has a little address on the front. So they're typically packets of maybe a tenth of a second, but there is what we call a header on the front of each packet that says, I am heading for Mr. Joe Bloggs at number 3562 in Bristol. So that it is just shot in here, almost like posting a letter into a post box. And as it comes down here at Leeds, this computer reads all these headers and shuffles the little packets of information off down the appropriate lines, and when it gets to Bristol, it shuffles the appropriate user. So that again, if you inspected one of these lines, you would see, almost like cars whistling down the motorway, a whole series of little segments of different people's computer conversations following each other down the line. And one of the, and you pay for that per packet, so that if you wait for a few minutes without sending anything, you don't pay. And if you suddenly want to send a big lump, it's a bit like driving a lorry down the motorway or a convoy, you just occupy more of it for a fraction of a second, and other people just catch up a fraction of a second later. That's the packet switching service. I think that's the end of the slides. Thanks. Well, what I'd like to... sorry, yeah, thanks. What I'd like to do now, if I may, is to say a word about the possible impact of all of this on architecture and planning. I think the proposition I'd like to put to you is that technologies can, perhaps in a rather crude way, be divided into what you might call dominant technologies and servile technologies. And what I mean by dominant technologies are technologies that have a big impact on the physical environment, that cause fundamental upheavals in the distribution of homes and workplaces and in the nature of people's lives. And by servile technologies, I mean very unobtrusive and self-effacing technologies that don't have that sort of impact, or at least not that kind of obvious impact on the physical environment. I would class water power, steam power, cars, and indeed reinforced concrete as dominant technologies, because I think that each of those has had a very substantial impact on the physical environment, that water power caused people to cluster in their dwellings around water mills, steam power caused people to leave the land and congregate in great cities for industrial production. Cars caused the building of great roads and car parks and the rest of it, and indeed opened up whole new areas of residential development. Reinforced concrete and steel construction enabled people to build quite new kinds and sizes of physical buildings. And all of those things, I think, had a tremendous physical impact on where we live, where we work, and the kind of physical surroundings in which we do it. Now, to take a couple of examples of servile technologies, I think, instance electricity, or at least electricity in the form we now know it, as a relatively servile technology, in that one uses electricity left, right, and centre all over the place, from the transistor radio to the heating and the lighting and the electric kettle and the cooker and so on. So that electricity is very, very deeply penetrated into people's day-to-day lives at work and at home. But if you were to go to a town like, say, Cambridge, where I live, and you went and sort of walked around there, visited it pre-electricity, and then you came and walked around and visited it post-electricity, I find it at least difficult to identify substantial physical changes that have occurred as a result of electricity. Okay, the place would be bright at night, I suppose, but I mean, in terms of the kinds of places where people work, the kinds of places where they live, the kinds of movements, physical movements they make between them, I don't personally see electricity as having had a very obvious impact on that. And I think one of the reasons why it hasn't had a very obvious impact is that it is an extraordinarily flexible and portable kind of technology, that given the facilities for electricity distribution, if you want to have electric points around your house, or you want to convert your factory from a coal-fired machine to an electrically driven machine, you can actually do it very unobtrusively. You don't have to sort of carry your factory to the electricity or redesign or rebuild the whole thing. Now, I think that telecoms is a servile technology in an even more extreme form, because we do have 30 million telephones in this country today, millions of telephone conversations made every day, telephone used constantly by people at home and work as a useful tool of their existence. But I find it very difficult personally to put my finger on, with confidence, on any substantial physical change that one could attribute to the telephone. I think if the telephone had never been invented, I suspect that the kind of houses that people live in, the kind of houses or buildings they work in, the kind of movements they make between them and so on, I would have thought these, frankly, would be very similar. I think they'd be less efficient because the availability of the telephone enables people to save a lot of time, to get things done quicker, to keep in touch and so on. But in terms of impact on the physical environment, I find it difficult to pin that down. And again, I would rationalize that by saying that the telephone is so extremely adaptable that if you want, take a pre-war housing estate where there are no phones 20, 30 years ago, and you come back today or next year and it's full of telephones. They didn't need to change anything else. They didn't need to change the shapes or sizes of the houses or their distribution or the way they led their lives. It was just a convenient little additive feature to their lives. But it was one that, because it doesn't involve a great consumption of physical space, because it doesn't create noise or pollution and so on, it's something that can kind of trickle in a very unobtrusive way into people's lives without substantial physical upheavals. I think if my proposition that telecoms is a servile technology holds water, it seems to me that perhaps what one might conclude from that is that the first conclusion one might draw is that in the field of architecture and construction, that one of the main impacts of information technology is going to be in the process of designing and constructing buildings rather than in the end result. I can see 100 ways in which computers and telecommunications could be used to improve the efficiency, productivity, throughput, speed of construction, economy and so on of the design and the construction process. But I think the very civility of the technology prevents it having any great effect or any kind of directive effect on the end result. To take a crude example, if people were choosing to build Gothic cathedrals or aluminium factories, I mean, the technology, the information technology of computer-aided design, of logistic control of materials, rapid transmission of documents, and so on, all of this technology could be employed, I would suggest, just as easily in the design and construction of neo-Gothic cathedrals as in the design and construction of power stations or mass housing. I think that in terms of the impact on the physical environment, I'm not suggesting there'd be no impact, because clearly electronic technology has the potential to change the way we do all sorts of things. In Prestel, that I was showing you, could potentially, in the long term, undermine maybe newspapers or magazines or provide quite new ways for people to get information. The whole field of shopping could be altered substantially through being able to shop for goods at a distance from a video screen. One can well imagine that people could work from their homes or from neighborhood work centers through the use of telecommunications. But in all of these cases, I think I'd suggest that telecommunications and computing technology is the enabling factor rather than the driving or directing force. If people want to work close to their homes and are determined to give up the business of commuting into city centres, then telecom would give them, I think, in the future the opportunity to do that. But if people like to continue to commute into the city centres because they like the life or the variety, the stimulus of herding together with other people and all of the excitement of working in an urban environment, then I don't think that all the telecommunications in the world will drag them away from that and have them working at the bottom of their gardens. Or to take the example of shopping, that I think it's very facile to think that because you could have a terminal that you could see a cake or a cauliflower on a screen and you could push a button to buy it, that people will therefore do that, because I think there are all kinds of other stimuli and satisfaction that people get from going out of the house and going around shopping, which they wouldn't get through staring at the screen. Perhaps if I could just end by commenting on some of the rather futuristic scenarios that have been advanced over the years about the impact that telecoms might have. I've got a couple of quotes here that I thought might amuse you. E.M. Forster wrote an interesting short story called The Machine Stops. And in this he postulated one kind of sort of extreme and rather exotic scenario of where telecom technology might lead. Imagine, E.M. Forster wrote, a small room hexagonal in shape like the cell of a bee. It is lighted neither by window nor by lamp, yet it is filled with a soft radiance. There are no apertures for ventilation, yet the air is fresh. There are no musical instruments, and yet at the moment that my meditation opens, this room is throbbing with melodious sounds. An armchair is in the centre, and by its side a reading desk. That is all the furniture. And in the armchair there sits a swaddled lump of flesh, a woman about 5 feet high with a face as white as a fungus. It is to her that this little room belongs. There were buttons and switches everywhere, buttons to call for food, for music, for clothing. There was a hot bath button, by pressure of which a basin of imitation marble rose out of the floor, filled the brim with a warm deodorized liquid. And there were, of course, the buttons by which she communicated with her friends. The clumsy system of public gatherings had long since been abandoned. Neither she nor her audience stirred from her rooms. Seated in her armchair, she spoke, while they in their armchairs heard her fairly well and saw her fairly well. And the story goes on, and the point of the story is that this great machine that supported all of this activity did eventually collapse and leave them all stranded like little fungi in their cells.
When was that written?
Sorry?
When was that written?
1932.
Oh.
He was with it, wasn't he?
After his death.
No, it was then, well, I mean, that I think is one kind of extreme stereotype of the way all of this might lead, but I think it's quite interesting that 50 years later, when a lot of this technology is available, I don't actually think personally there's any sign of that happening. And I think that even television, I think, can be shown to have stimulated a lot of interest in outside and practical activities of all sorts. Another sort of extreme scenario is that of which perhaps we'll be more familiar, of George Orwell's 1984. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the over-fulfillment of the 9th three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made above the level of a very low whisper would be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plot commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or on what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. Well, I think, again, I find that interesting because the technology certainly exists for all of us to be snooped on in our homes through telescreens, but it doesn't happen, and I personally don't think it's very likely to happen, and I don't think telecoms would have that much to do with it, because frankly, if we lived in a society where it was regarded as socially acceptable for that kind of thing to happen, it could be done without technology. There could be sort of uniformed snoopers walking around the streets, peering in through your windows. So that, again, I draw some hope from the fact that 1984 is a couple of years away and we don't seem to have got to that yet. Another scenario I was going to mention was recollecting from my own student days as an architect, the exciting archigram spectacles of people sitting on sort of heaths and mountains with great screens suspended from balloons and things rather like this at their elbow, I think disguised as rocks in some case, which I certainly found a very stimulating and exciting image. Again, I suppose maybe it happened a bit in pop concerts and so on, but again, it doesn't seem to me to happen very much. And I think that despite the fact that one could go and sit on Hampstead Heath with this thing or similar things, it seems to me that in fact there are very fundamental desires on people's part to get away from the technology, to go and sit on a heath or walk through a forest without telephones attached to the trunk of every tree. And this would confirm me in my view that it's really the human, the social wishes that drive this thing, and the telecoms technology is the servant. So I hope I haven't desperately overrun my time, but I'd be glad to go into any discussion.
Can I ask a first question? An eye is a transducer, is it not?
Mm.
It turns light impulses into electrical impulses down a nerve.
Mm.
Has anybody ever been able to cut that transducer out and take the electrical impulses straight to the passage to the brain?
Some work has been done on that in America, particularly I think in connection with trying to help blind people see. And you may have seen this equally, but I do recall a rather bizarre television program on this subject in which one of the participants sort of lifted his hair above his ear, and there was a neat socket, rather like the thing behind you in the floor there, in the side of his head. Somebody advanced towards him with a wire and stuck it in, and held a television camera. This was a blind chap. And he apparently was capable, in a very, very crude way, they then, of course, from that socket had some little, I suppose, silver or gold wires, sort of electrodes touching appropriate points of the brain. And apparently it was in a very crude way possible for this guy to see. If you held a hand in front of the television camera, he could, I think, just about tell whether it was a hand or a bottle, say. The other approach, which seemed to me rather more humane, was to wear on your back a kind of prickly waistcoat, which tickled your back in the appropriate pattern, which I think I'd prefer rather than having a socket in my skull. And so what that did was it had a grid of little prodders, and you would hold the television camera up in front of the bottle, and it would then impress on your back the shape of a bottle. We actually have, I don't know whether you would have come across this, but working in my own department, a blind typist using a really quite remarkable machine called an opticon, which, this is not quite the answer to your question, but I think it's in the same area, which is a small thing about the size of my radio pager, which he passes across a page of text, and it then reads the text and reproduces it on a little grid of sort of needle-like things, about 20 of them, and he has the index finger of his other hand on this little grid of prodders, and he can read continuous text, not quite as fast as you or I could, but he's able to just, for example, he proofreads his typing in this way, and he's able, rather as in Braille, to take in the letters through the tip of the finger.
Questions from the discussion?
How far away are we from actually being able to translate voice into text?
Well, translating text into voice is relatively easy, and there are systems that will synthesize speech, as it's called, where you can type in words and then a rather kind of mechanical voice will speak the words. And that is used quite widely in the States now for things like telephone banking. You can call up your bank on a push-button phone and then punch in some numbers meaning what is my current account, and then the computer will say minus $200 or whatever. And so that is relatively easy, because what they do in the computer is just store all the little phonemes of speech and string them together and pump them up. The other way round is to a trained speaker with a limited vocabulary is here. There are in industrial applications, I think at airports, for example, people sit, say, in a loudspeaker, Los Angeles, Detroit, Chicago, as they see the baggage go by, and the machine knows and puts the appropriate sticker on. It can tell the difference between Los Angeles, Chicago, and Detroit. But in those systems, you generally have to train them by the appropriate person speaking the desired words, and you have to have a limited vocabulary. But for speech, I mean, in the sense of a dictating machine, for you to be able to dictate a letter and for the machine to produce it in type, I think in practice is at least 20 or 30 years away. And the classic problem that's adduced in that is what's known as the grey tape problem. That if you say to a machine grey tape, are you saying grey tape, G-R-E-Y, new word T-A-P-E, or are you saying great ape, G-R-E-A-T-A-P-E? And in fact, if you listen to those words as they're normally said, I mean, they're virtually identical, great ape, great ape. And it is the context that the human brings to it that knows whether they're talking about apes or tape. To have a computer that is capable of interpreting the context of words is a formidable task, which I think is a few decades away.
Alex, how expensive is it to send something by teletext rather than by letter? Because that's next year, isn't it? Is it a real alternative? I mean,
well, there's the cost of the equipment at each end. I mean, the sort of Siemens and Philips machines I was showing there cost a few £1,000s. So, I mean, it's like the cost of a word processor, maybe £4,000 or £5,000 at each end. But the cost.
You have to have it all the time. So
well, it is a store and forward device, which means that if the other person's machine is occupied, your machine will try again until it's free. So once you dump the letter into your local store, you can forget about it, and the machine will try until it gets it through. But the actual transmission, probably cheaper than at first class, but of course depends. I mean, you see, for 14 pence you can send 40 pages, perhaps, or 20 pages. But if you were sending a single page, it would be cheaper than first class post, I'm sure.
I wasn't pretty clear about your servile and your dominant technology. I couldn't really see how you could divide into those two elements. If you talk about electricity, and obviously it will lead to the robot in a situation, I suppose if we have to say what is the biggest change of the 20th century, probably is servant activities in the sense of office activities. And offices are basically the outcome of electricity. There were no offices which were practically for electricity. You might argue the typewriter was the beginning of it, really, it was probably electricity. Difficult to argue. I think one of the concrete is any more important, it's just more massive. The robot will probably be the outcome of electricity. The robot is like the micro robot, which will be as close as possible to being equal to the highest form, bar possibly mankind, and maybe later on more than mankind. And that will be some form of electric charge. I don't know whether you can make these efficient. And it will change society very violently.
Well, I wonder, I mean, could we just debate your point about electricity a little? I mean, I know it's difficult to imagine, but suppose that electricity hadn't been invented. And let's consider the National Westminster Bank, for example. I would have thought the National Westminster Bank, as an institution, but also in terms of buildings, would probably have happened equally well with gas rather
than
with
concrete.
Sorry?
Same with concrete. I mean, I don't see the difference. I mean, you can't argue the National Westminster Bank is there because of concrete. Anyway, you might argue it's there because of electricity, certainly because of concrete, because before that you had mud. I don't think the two are, that what you're, and I don't think you can, I think what you're saying is, and with that is that we shouldn't be concerned in a worried way. It's a servant activity, but all of it's a servant activity.
Well, I think, I mean, maybe I put concrete in the wrong category, but I think
one which is actually not in that.
Well, I suppose I was thinking, I mean, if one, I suppose what I was groping for is if one considers the Industrial Revolution, it did produce, I would have thought, a very substantial upheaval in the physical environment. I mean, if I imagine kind of people living in medieval villages, going to market and tilling the fields, and then one imagines sort of Manchester, Birmingham with vast clanking factories and rows of
because of steam
power.
power.
Yes, I mean, it seems to me that steam power, well, I know something, either steam power presumably, did actually cause people.
It's a continuation of the same thing, electricity, as far as I would have thought. I mean, if you like an intellectual system, it's just a continuation of that steam power into a different form of power which is more refined. It would be difficult to argue that, I'm just saying offices, in a sense, are less or more important, and you could argue that the whole way that, I mean, cities are dominated by these places which used to be factories are now offices. There's a major change in the way that cities work, which later on will probably be diffused again as we get more capable of doing our own thing in our own place, which will be yet another change upon the centralization or decentralization of the cities in architectural form, which is what you were discussing. So I thought it's a major element, just like steam power, and in the sense of what, and in that sense, going to microcommunications and what you're talking about, which is probably the second industrial revolution, if you like. That is going to again change those patterns, but I would agree with you that they are at our, we can control them rather than or well in a theory that they control us. I would have thought. Sorry.
Actually, none of those things were causes, were they? They were instruments which allowed other things to happen. If I was talking about the form of cities and the idea of distribution or collectivity, I'm not quite sure what it is we're talking about actually, but if I was talking about sort of the form, the collective effects of, which is something to do with the market values of cities and the way in which an area like the city achieves value and density, then there are certain technologies which enabling technologies for those things to happen, and for people who wish to live in a low density way, use the railway system or transport system to distribute themselves, and those are enabling technologies. And it seems to me that I was very interested by your distinction, and the suggestion is that in some way electricity is neutral in that respect, and the question really is, I'm not quite sure if that's true or not. I think it probably is, because whether these physical differences between low and high densities depend upon electricity, I'm not sure. Even on gas, I mean, what is affecting? What way does electricity affect that actually, Richard?
Well, you reverse the question. You can ask what does affect those elements, if you like. In other words, it's purely an element. I don't think you could divide
travel. Yes,
well, you can't travel.
Technology of travel
Communications
is obviously has been enabling technology, which has affected the form of things very much.
Travel is highly limited if you can't tell somebody you're coming, for instance. It's very difficult if all you can do is to get on your horse and continue to get to arrive there. I'm just saying, it's part of, I'm not saying it's different. I don't think there's any way you can divide it. I'm not saying it's the only element, but it is a major element which allows us to do. I mean, we are here because we got phone calls, probably. Otherwise, okay, the next thing is obviously carried by hand. But the electricity is a major element, and I would have thought what we're really saying is that it will become the major element, probably the only other element that's ever happened in modern society, possibly is steam, for a much shorter period, I suspect.
You see, I think it's a very provocative distinction that has been made between technology which is somehow dominant and other types of technology that is subservient. Surely it is the use which society makes of that technology that determines whether it's one thing or the other. I mean, I think one of the most telling things that you did in connection with that argument was to put up your map of the packet switching network. And the centres of those packet switching networks were in fact the centres that developed as a result of 19th century technology, but nothing to do with information at all. Now, if you had made shipping software the centre of the information world, and you had sort of radiated from there, I think perhaps we would have started in a rather different way.
Well, sure, but I think the way that works as far as the centres of packet switching are concerned, I think it is simply that we, because it's a very flexible technology, we can put the centres where we wish. I mean, I think quite an interesting point is that something like canals or railways or docks have certain geographical constraints. I mean, if you're building a dock, you can't build it in Chipping Swansbury, you have to be by the sea. And so, because telecoms is such a very unobtrusive sort of technology, we can put the centres where we wish. We don't have to have, great areas of flat land or particular elevation or whatnot. So what we do in practice is to put them where they'll be most useful, and as you say, where they will be most useful is where the people already are, which is in the great industrial cities. But I think the point I would make, I mean, I didn't mean really dominant and servile in any pejorative sense, but I think what I had in mind perhaps was that one of the features of telecoms is that it's very placeless, that it does conquer distance, and that therefore you don't actually need to move to take advantage of it. I mean, to take the example of steam, I mean, it seems to me, I think why I would speak of steam as dominant, or even the canals, is that they were geographically constrained in where they could be put. You could only put in practice water power where there were streams. You could only put in practice big steam operations close to the coal because of the cost of transporting the coal. So that those resources had a certain geographical constraint inherent in them, which meant that if you wanted to take advantage of that, I mean, clearly the option would be to neglect it. I mean, you could just forget that
So
coal existed.
what you're talking about geographical.
Yes,
That's not dominant or non-dominant. It's a geographical.
yes, but I think that with telecom, I mean, if you...
But the whole change, I mean, I'm involved in an organisation called Lloyd's. I mean, it's scared out of its wits about the fact that Lloyd's won't be in London because of communications.
Yes.
Because nowadays, where it used to be very handy to have everything nicely set in the city of London, and all ships came out from there and so on. And it's Lloyd's Insurance. That was a very nice sort of central situation. Now, there's no reason for Lloyd's to be in Lloyd's. The problem is, except for a certain know-how, which they also realise, that except if they get moving very fast, it's a know-how which everybody else can have. Therefore, in a sense, you could argue that what may be either the building up of new centres or the needs of one centre is basically because of the way you can now spread out communications, so that in fact the advantages that Lloyd's used to have prior to this very fast communication systems. I mean, now the key thing is that, I mean, there are, I'm just taking an example involved in that site. In America, they sort of proudly state, you know, if you have an insurance claim, you will get the money within 24 hours.
Right.
That is the new centre, in a sense. Those that can put that centre, and how do they do it? By electrical systems. Now, it's not, I'm not trying to say that is, I don't want to overstress that, but there are major social and technical, the technology is servant, but it is allowing changes to happen, which could not have been done before.
It's a very good example, if I may say, I mean, broking rooms are a wonderful example of how the technology which you are selling are used. If you go into a typical broking room, there's very little happening except for a few seconds on any telestream. And when that happens, something it may be happening in Tokyo or it may be happening in Chicago. And it's a 24-hour job because the world is going round all the time. And one can imagine it's a very short step electronically between there having to be a Lloyd's or there having to be any broking room, and there just being a lot of villas.
Yes, well, yes, I mean, I do, and I'm encouraged to hear what you say, because being in telecoms, it's obviously nice to feel that one's doing something that might have an impact. But I suppose I speak maybe from a certain... well, I mean, it kind of servile, it is a bit pejorative, isn't it, really? You want to be servile. But I think, I mean, I speak perhaps maybe from a certain sort of disappointment and disillusionment here, in that as an architectural student 20 years ago, I saw all of these kind of things then in the lab and thought to myself, my God, how exciting, this is going to transform the way we live, that we're, you know, that there's going to be fundamental upheavals here, that the cities will be dead and there will all be new things in chipping Sodbury or whatnot. And yet when I look 20 years later at what's happened, I mean, and perhaps to put the cap on it, funnily enough, I had a meeting yesterday morning with somebody from a firm of estate agents to float to him the proposition that we take, actually Malmesbury was the place a bit near Chipping Sodbury. And I said to him, look, I have an idea, I said, for making money for British Telecom, which is that we buy up a whole lot of land in and around, say, Malmesbury, and we then build the most super-duper communications Malmesbury. And we're coming to a point about the map. That Malmesbury is the great big red blob there with if you're in Malmesbury, you know, people can instantly get in touch with you from all over the world. I said, you know, my plan is, you see, that just like these guys made their fortunes in 19th century America by buying land and then building railways to the land and then building skyscrapers, I said, why don't we buy some land, build some telecoms to the land and then get rich? And this chap, it just, you know, it didn't cut any ice from the toilet. He's a man who makes his living out of buying something property, and he said, look, he said, I'm afraid there is just no way. He said, if you came to me, if you sought my professional advice on this matter, he said, rents in Malmesbury are £3 a square foot. And he said, if you went in there and stuck dishes on the roofs and special links and so on, he said, might raise the value of the rents, but he said there's absolutely no evidence it would. And he said, I mean, as far as, you know, my professional advice would be concerned, you'd be better spend your money on something else. And I think I am very struck by I don't know what the source of it is, but it does seem to me there's an extraordinary stability in these things. To take even your example of Lloyd's, I mean, in fact, the best telecommunications are being provided right there in the heart of the city because of this kind of circular thing that the Lloyd's brokers are in the city. They demand the very best communications. So we put all the best communications into the city. So it becomes the place the Japanese banks want to be. And I think I suppose I'm just really arguing about timescale, but my impression is that it's going to be a very long, slow process
Yes,
for
sure,
these fundamental changes to occur.
Change already. I mean, I would have thought that the problem. I don't know about Lloyd's and I don't know about the city, but then it seems to me that there's a kind of inertia of value and expertise, which is partly mystique, which it seems to me is inherent in the sort of economic system we have, which will sustain itself. But the inner cities in general, which used to be industrial cities, like Docklands of London and Liverpool and the other sort of large conurbations, have lost their value because of the failure of the obsolescence of the economic and technical kind of basis on which they thrived. And your map did interest me. In fact, particularly as Cambridge was on that map, and that area.
So was Slough.
That was to do with another kind of what you might call another sort of value pattern throughout the country, which is to do with not. I don't suppose it's to do at this moment, at this point in time, with so much of telecommunications as with roads, but the two are related, and it's to do with the general sort of distribution and decentralization. And I would have thought that there was this falling of value in cities and rising in value.
Yeah, but you see, absolutely. I mean, could I just make a couple of points about that map? One is that what's quite interesting about the packet switching services is the first service that we've ever offered, where the prices are quite independent of distance. I mean, those nodes it doesn't actually affect the customer where those nodes are, because if you make a packet switching call between any two points in the country, the cost is exactly the same, even if it's across town or across the country. Because the cost of transmission is becoming so cheap, our marketing people decided that was the best way to sell it. So it's quite interesting in that it is the first telecom service which is completely distance independent in its pricing. But I think coming back to a point about the factors of Liverpool-Manchester, I mean, this estate agent yesterday, I said to him, I pinned it down, I said, well, look, why is it that rents in Bristol are £8 a square foot and rents in Malmesbury are £3 a square foot? And I said, if we gave them super-duper communications in Malmesbury, the office people are in the business of shunting information. Sure, if they have tremendous information facilities, it'll bump the rents up.
I think the chap was wrong. I think you were right.
Well, I mean, his answer was that he said it's 100 things of why Bristol is £8 a square foot. He said it's the M4, the university.
You'll be right in it because IBM went to Portsmouth, not because Portsmouth was a nice place to be, but because there was spare capacity in the Cosham Exchange. Simplistically, as I understand, they could actually get good communications between London and Portsmouth. There was you actually had the physical capacity for them. I mean, that's why Willis's went to it.
Oh, can I say that what he did concede was the negative point. He told me some anecdote about Newbury, where apparently it was impossible to get a phone for about 5 years, and he said that this pushed the property values in Newbury down to £2 a square foot because it was impossible to get the phone. So he quite accepted that inability to get telephone lines was a depressant of rents. But his proposition was that provided you can get sort of good old telephone service, that all these other wonders are of doubtful significance.
So how much is your technology actually sort of rooted in actually making a sort of place that is a sort of communication centre? I mean, what actually would you put in Malmesbury that you couldn't have spread about all over the place? Would you put some real useful hardware? Would there be actually some wires coming to Malmesbury that you couldn't do through the air and things like that?
Well, I mean, one of the points I would make is that it is actually cheaper to communicate in considerable volume. So it's actually cheaper to communicate between London and Birmingham than between London and Malmesbury, because there are economies of scale in these microwave links. So that what you get at present is, I mean, it bears out Richard's point and the other's point about the permanence here, that if you go between the existing centres of population, it's actually cheaper to communicate there, so you get more volume there, so you get more communication, so it gets to be yet cheaper. Now, one of the things one could do with Malmesbury is if you said we are going to build Malmesbury up as a kind of tele-city place linked to London, one of the things you would do would be to put in a fat communications link from London to Malmesbury, and you could, at least in theory, just simply offer cheaper communications between Malmesbury and London than hitherto. So one thing would be cheapness. But the other thing is that some of the more advanced facilities are most economically provided on a shared basis in the sense of terminal equipment. For example, if you want to hold a video conference, a meeting with 5 people in one place and 5 people in another, that studio could cost £50,000. Now, my thought about Malmesbury type of operation is that you would install some shared central facilities of that kind that people could walk to and go and use or rent by the hour. Things like facsimile transmission. You can get, if you want to send a 100-page document through one of those machines, it's extremely cumbersome, the machine I showed you, because you've got like a small copier, you've got to feed in one at a time. If you have a sufficient community of users, you could offer on some central basis a really high-powered facsimile machine that could churn the stuff through very quickly. And I suppose what I had in mind was that you might get a virtuous circle going, of that if you then had more people of that kind there, that you could then afford the more better communications, then there'd be more people and you get it going. But I don't know, I mean, could I, if I may, just sort of put back to you another question on a rather different kind to do with the design of buildings themselves. I mean, I don't know, as people designing buildings of all kinds, do you feel any influence of electronic technology there? I mean, when you're sitting down and designing buildings, are you saying to yourself, oh yes, these people, take the example of office buildings, these people will be using electronic office equipment, therefore I must design this building in some different or special way on that account? I mean, I suppose at a trivial level one needs generous ducts, but I mean,
well,
at a more...
not trivial.
No? Not trivial.
20 times, we're talking about, I mean, this is intriguing, in fact, a question I'd like to ask you, because, I mean, we're into an intriguing situation where it looks at the moment as though energy consumption is going up, but it'll probably reach a plateau before going down as we use less energy. We are working in an area where different consultants have given us figures between 20 times the output of energy for an office building or list of Lloyd's to less than the amount of energy. The difference is this: the air conditioning system is out of your mind. I mean,
Oh, so this is from the electronic equipment, you mean?
energy is just given. I'm just giving that as a sort of now. No one seems to know whether we're discussing it with a sort of American sort of Stanford or IBM exactly where that situation where it is, and it is an intriguing problem because of course, if some of the more I suppose the word is conservative in the sense of the amount of energy that is likely to be put out, those who optimize that amount, if they were right, which I don't believe they are right, we're going to have a hell of a lot of offices which can't cope, that's for sure. I doubt it, because I suspect what will happen is that the machinery will have to adapt to those offices which are already built, so it's the usual situation, so the machinery will move that much faster at one end, and we will actually change that much slower to allow, because we're not going to destroy everything we have around us. But on top of that, which is just as much technical, of course, the actual organizations, what will be interesting over a period of time, it is always a question of how long that period is how will the organizations change? I mean, if you go back to this, I think the main reasons why, which determines the probably position of buildings, organizations, or towns is in fact the ability to get the right people to work in them, which is know-how, personal know-how. Probably in the end, even if it's Ipswich, they don't go there just because of the telephone exchange. That is an element in the choice of a number of places. But the number one thing is that they know they can get those people to go there from wherever they were before, or from somewhere else, or whether it's it's Greenwich or whether it's Portsmouth. So it's people know-how, which is the key thing. Face-to-face is a very important element still within all this talking and so on. But how that will actually change once you have this machinery working, how we will change that, and what will happen to the standard 15 meter wide office building, which I'm just and all that is difficult to tell, but obviously it will change. It must change it, because in the end we will have we will be working in a different way.
The interesting thing, you still have a stock.
We'll still have
a stock of the
absolutely.
and your argument about the I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of bothered me very much, so fairly recently, was the sense that one had to keep contemplating the nation that buildings ought to keep fitting new social institutions or technologies and so on, I increasingly feel that I think it's the other way around. And you can just say
society is buildings.
Well, and yes, inevitably, technologies. Yes, all the sort of all the bits that, like people and the servile technologies, have to be servile to the predominantly existing situation. That's insofar as the buildings represent absolutely massive sort of fixed situation. It cannot change very much.
But could I ask, to what extent do you think that is financial investment or psychological investment? I mean, it seems to me that that there's a great desire on people's part to sort of hang on to the physical environment, whatever the financial. I mean, people spend quite a lot of money preserving the physical environment.
In England especially.
Sorry?
In England especially, yes.
So, I mean, I don't know.
It's going to go on.
Well,
I think that may be a
Thomas-
current thing. I see that being reversed rather drastically sometimes. I'm not sure what circumstances it would be, but it is a sort of fact.
60 years is about the average life of buildings in London. And that includes the old ones. So this, even that is, I mean, it's a medium-sized sort of turnover. 60 to 70 years is I think the calculations.
And surely there's a point where the sort of existing environment must become such an inconvenience and such an embarrassment and such a bore that, you know, society doesn't want to continue to serve the environment. I mean, the environment is meant to serve people.
But it's an economic thing too, because net to gross has a lot of relevance, and working conditions and net to gross and so on. So there's, I think one of the things that changes the building if you're working in it, or if you're letting it, is the efficiency of it. And of course, there's been tremendous change in the nowadays where you're spending in the city of London £30 a square foot. You can afford to knock the building down every couple of years practically, as long as your increase is sufficient in turnover and in density and so on terms. Now then there's a whole lot of historical factors and so on, which obviously
But it seems to me that the dominant technologies that you were talking about earlier, they were sort of, I don't know the history of it all, but they were sort of invented or developed in order to create the metropolis, which was developed for certain marketing reasons, wasn't it? You know,
People saw they could. I didn't know they would.
well, I mean, the metropolis was only possible because of the development of the technology of transportation, of physical
Rail
transportation. Well, rail transportation and road transportation and all the rest, all the different sorts of physical transportation. But it seems to me that the potential of telecommunications and electronics has an equally fundamental possibility to allow people to work in a totally different sort of a way, which might be a hell of a sight cheaper and more convenient.
Or not
less
worse.
expensive, or whatever, but which might give people much more time on their hands. It might cost people an awful lot less. I mean, I think there's a tremendous price which people pay for actually working in a metropolis in terms of time and in terms of money. And it seems to me that telecommunications has the possibility to reduce that cost considerably.
Right.
I would have thought.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the things you describe as dominant actually have a physical manifestation, which is really the big difference. The thing about the electronic thing is that it's magic. In effect, that you can pick that up and talk to someone and she comes. It's magic. And that's the big difference. And the business of architecture having some, or being affected is sort of inconsequential at that level. I mean, the level of being able to talk to someone in New York, just like that. Not even.
I mean, in a funny. I mean,
exactly. But architecture is almost inconsequential.
It affects, but it can make a lot of it unnecessary.
No, it may make it unnecessary.
That's the whole point of it, isn't it?
The interesting thing is architecture only changes when you change the rules.
Yes.
A church is a church.
Yeah.
No. Offices were invented whenever, 50, 60 years ago. And it's when someone invented that use that suddenly...
It wasn't invented to use.
Yes, it did.
No, once upon a time, as in Dickens, you had a man with a quill pen. The problem was that that was all you had.
Then you
write
get
without
more
ledger.
people together in that one...
It wasn't an invention. The invention of the quill pen situation moved on when you started to get something which could communicate. Typewriter was probably one of the major, the simplified typewriter was a major element of the typing pool, and the fact that it becomes efficient to have more than one. But even more important probably was Bell and his telephone and the whole communication system. That is that organization led to a new form of building. Doesn't mean you can't adapt previous buildings, because you can still work in the mill, but
It
it's
didn't
more efficient.
actually lead to a new form of building.
Well, the office building is not, I can't think of
Listen,
an office
if
building.
you go into the city and look at early office, I don't know, take a Lutchins building, a telephone period building.
Yep.
They're exactly the same as an office building you see today.
Well, try and persuade your developer to build a Lutchins building.
Oh, but
see what happens.
but
He's dealing in nice hard facts, what he can sell, and therefore what there is in his opinion, a demand, which doesn't. I mean, it leaves the historicism for the moment. He is dealing is what is there a demand for? It's craft, if you like. But sure ain't a Lutchins office building at the moment, in the sense of how you work.
But could I pick up the point about the Lutchins buildings? I think that's a very intriguing and a rather puzzling one, which is that. It would seem to me, if you said to a developer, we're planning to build a Lutchins building here, his objection would be to do with the usable square foot that could be got out of it. Now, why would he object to that, and why didn't the guy in 1890 object to that? I would suggest that it's nothing to do with the telephone, it's nothing to do with the fact that this telephone there wasn't a telephone then. I would suggest what it's to do with is that there has been a tremendous growth in the service sector in the last 58 years.
Why?
Well, I think that I think my proposition would be that it's because once people's, I mean, there's a limit to the amount of physical things that you can make and sell to people, and so you then move on to start selling them invisibles of various kinds. But I mean, if I could I just come back to that question? I mean, it seems to me that the curious thing is that, or the slightly sort of counterintuitive thing, is that one might think that through the invention of the telephone, that space in the square mile of the city would be less valuable. I mean, if somebody had said to me 80 years ago that here's a Lutchins building in Finsbury Circus, it's worth so much, there's now everybody's going to have a telephone. My instinct would be to say, well, in that case, these guys can be 5 miles, 10 miles, maybe 25 miles away and still do their business. And therefore, I would expect the space in Finsbury Circus to be less valuable. But in fact, the space in Finsbury Circus has become so valuable.
Yes, because you've got more, you're always looking, if I may say, at one element at a time. You've got the human element, the face-to-face group, which as well as the other. But if I can make it simpler, there's only one thing which has made the high-rise building. It isn't somebody suddenly thinking, what a good idea to have a high-rise building. It's called a lift.
Right. Yeah.
Okay? That's
right.
a simple physical thing. So
Yeah.
why can't we go a little bit, quarter of a step further forward, and presume the electricity after the hydraulic lift made the lift go up? Okay. And that is a major physical change. I don't know whether anybody would like to say that the lift didn't
But
make a
that would
high-rise
come into
building.
your category of a dominant technology, a lift.
No, wait a minute, the lift didn't make a high-rise building, it enabled
It actually enabled the high-rise building. No, but the point I'm making is the electricity is the organisation it is a servant organisation, I'm not saying, but it allows it, because I mean, probably there were lots of people who thought, God, it would be terrific to be able to go up 20 stories, 30 stories, and we have got buildings, obviously, as we know perfectly well, which, you know, with the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or whatever, like the buildings, the biblical buildings, which are taller, but they have great difficulties of how you got up to them, and somebody thought, nice, we can do it nice and easy to go up there. Therefore, that opens up a new possibilities, new possibilities which may have been partly thought of, but two are welded together. And I don't think you can have a dominant and a non-dominant form of technology. You can have more massive, more geographical, more things like that.
I mean, I suppose what I was about to just pick up for another point about the sort of magical nature of telecoms, the slightly zany thought that occurred to me while he was speaking, apropos speaking in Chicago, is let's postulate that the technology of telecoms required you to be 500 feet above the ground with your handset held to your head, and the other guy needs to be 500 feet up, and then through the magic of telecommunications you can communicate. Now, it's extremely valuable to be able to speak to somebody in Chicago if you've got to close a great deal. And if the technology had been of that sort, I would suggest there would be great towers sort of all over the city, 500 feet high, with people sort of whistling up them in order to speak to Chicago from
Even
the
if
top
they
of
had
them.
to walk.
Even if they had to walk, right? Because, you know, if you had to go up a 500-foot tower to do it, you would have built the towers and done it. But, I mean, this technology is so sort of magical and so detached from ordinary brick and mortar.
I find this another intriguing word. It's as though suddenly we've got magic. The first time a kettle boiled around this, but it was magic. When suddenly we realised that, I mean, I can't remember who found out that air was actually a substance, but it was somebody who lived in Sicily, if I remember rightly, who was a Greek. You know, that was a magical moment when he actually found out if he tipped the bucket upside down and put it in water, the water didn't fill it. I mean, this is magic. We mustn't get over it. You know, magic is
It's an Arthur C. Clarke definition of high technology is when it's magic.
But it's of all things, throughout history, there is something like electricity, the first one. You know, air is a fabulous magic atmospheric element. Balloons are fabulous. As I say, air, you know, it's simple. Electricity is an element which allows us further possibilities to live a life, if we can understand it properly, which is that much better. That's a magic thing, sure.
Bring another model city. If you take the old offices are much older than 60 years ago. If you take the old city and you take a typical 5-story building with a warehouse in the bottom and maybe a warehouse on the top with some great cranky cranes taking things up and down, a bit of administration going on, the ability to communicate between somewhere in the middle of the city, which happens to be close to the river, and some storage depot maybe 50 miles away, and do all your invoicing and all your docketing at a distance, means that you move your administration temporarily, as I think it is, into an administration centre, and you can put up all the cheap space that you want to put up over large areas which are cheap, and they're cheap because they're separated from each other.
Yeah.
And I would have thought I would prefer liberating to dominating, but I would have thought that was fundamental to how something like electricity and then something like telecommunications can affect the way that cities are planned.
Yes,
absolutely fundamental.
Yes, I would.
I think streets which were 5 stories and continuous are now, I mean,
up and down.
Yeah.
It's a liberate. I agree. It's a servant activity in the sense that we dominate it. So far we dominate it.
I think you're surprisingly coy about it, actually. I mean, I'm surprised
It's
that
very
you
important.
are diving 100 years ahead.
It's a terrific servant activity.
Well, it must be the influence of this chap from the estate agents and my mom's. I thought, you know, I was so excited. I thought it was like
the... an estate agent, by the way.
Well, sorry, what was it? Surveyor.
Property consultant.
Property consultant.
I like real estate.
Real estate. But, you know, I mean, one of the things that excited me about that is that going back 100 years, when land was more virgin, it was possible to have very grand plans, not just for single buildings, but for, you know, connecting great places together and developing new things and all this. And I mean, one of the things I find a little bit dispiriting is partly because, as Richard said, as a fan of conservation, that it's awfully difficult to make substantial changes to the physical environment. And I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Clearly, one put up.
How long? What period are you talking about?
Well, I mean, I suppose I'm thinking of the particularly I suppose what happened in America, where it was so virgin that people could kind of open it up and actually decide, you know, here we build a city and that kind of thing. And it seemed to me that in theory at least, that, I mean, but you see with telecoms, one can manipulate it. I mean, there's nothing...
Well, Silicon Valley is a brand new society. Los Angeles started in 1906 about, I mean, as an approximation, you know, before the First World War. All these things obviously are changing, are developing, and it is influencing society directly, organizations, and even physically.
But could I ask this? I mean, if we look at the way telecoms is planned in this country, we in British Post Office spend about 2,000 million a year building the national telephone system, but we do it in a completely passive way. I mean, there is no grand architect of a telecommunications system, or nobody even conscious that they're planning something sort of structural and influential. I mean, that what my colleagues do is it's all done on a kind of a passive basis of saying how many traffic have we got flowing between London and Birmingham. That's the response basis, how much from here to here, and then they get out there things, or we better put in an extra pair of cables between there and there. It's completely responsive. Now, I mean, maybe that is good, but I think the question I would float is there, I mean, if telecoms is an important potential influence on all these things we've been discussing, should people be thinking about it in a more architectural sense of considering, well, you know, in a more positive sense, will we possibly want to, I don't know, regenerate Liverpool or open up Cornwall or something? You know, so we ought to be doing this and this. I mean, should there be a purposeful sense about it?
But if your organisation was in a sort of milieu like early 19th century capitalism, the milieu which, the financial milieu which was associated with the development of the railways, for example, one can imagine a totally different picture. I mean, if there was a sort of Brunel of telecommunications who was part of a capitalist system, then you'd have a sort of equivalent of the Great Western Railway Network, with all the associated property speculations going on at the same time.
How much are you
You've got it now. Dallas is oil. You're going to the Silicon Valley in that area.
I'm talking strictly about Alex's and responding strictly to his question about the institution that he's part of not being an entrepreneurial one, and that's the reason why it's responsive. And if it were entrepreneurial, and if its terms of reference were more capitalistic, I think then it would
or more
have
socialistic.
extraordinary ambitions.
Yeah, I mean, it could be equally. I mean, if we were part of the great sort of Bulgarian state or something, we might say, well, we want to open up the East Coast, we'll put all the communications there whether people want it or not. So, I mean, I don't think it's an ideological thing. But I think
it is different.
Well, I mean, I think you have to, if you're going to be directional about it, you need to have an ideology to drive you. Whether it needs left or right wing, I'm not sure. But the point I was going to add, if I may, is that, perhaps I should have mentioned, is that the present government did take a very fundamental decision a couple of years ago to introduce competition into telecoms in this country. So there is, in fact, now, to a considerable extent, that entrepreneurial opportunity you describe. I mean, the BP and Cable and Wireless and Barclays Bank have got together and have planned a rival optical fibre network to run around the major cities of the country as a rival to the British Telecom one. And if other people come up with other ideas, the government would welcome it. But, I mean, what is quite intriguing about the Barclays Bank Cable and Wireless thing is that it's, again, utterly responsive, because they're having to raise 50 million in the city for that scheme. So where do they run their link between London, Birmingham, Liverpool, Leeds, Manchester? And there's absolutely no, I mean, it's not entrepreneurial. Well, I mean, it's not, as it were, trying to change the world and create new value or new opportunities. It's not trying to turn sort of swamp into paradise.
How long is your industry going to be sort of relying on wires that are like little railway lines connecting up places? Because that's actually what will control, the location. I think that's what at the moment makes your Malmesbury idea a possibility, actually, because it causes concentrations of people. I mean, or how far off are you being totally free of wires and enabling a total infinite net to be established? Because then anything can happen anywhere. At the moment it can't happen anywhere. You couldn't put Lloyds in Spitalfields, for instance. I mean,
well, I think that
there isn't.
I found that.
In other words,
I got through to you this morning.
How long do you think you will need? How much longer do you think you will need concentrations of people to be able to communicate economically? I mean, why do you have to concentrate?
Is there
people
yeah.
from an economic point of view? Well, we have our consultants, our engineering consultants at whereas at Cirencester, and another lot in Bath, and it's a ghastly system to communicate with them. I want them back in London, and I can't see any conceivable system whereby we could actually design buildings without having them in London.
Except you tempt me. Well, you tempt me, if I may, to intrude a remark there, which is that I am firmly convinced the day will come when complete physical visual images of people can be reproduced at a distance with such fidelity that you cannot tell whether it's them or an image. And I mean, that will be, I think, a good 100 years away. But I think the analogy that's quite interesting is with sound. I mean, already, and I've done experiments with this, you can, with quite cheap equipment, reproduce somebody's voice behind the screen, so that the ordinary person cannot tell whether it is the human or his reproduced voice. Now, the rate of information that comes in through the ear is much, much lower than the rate that comes in through the eye, and therefore you need a much more powerful system to fool the eye. But I'm sure that if we don't blow ourselves up in the next couple of 100 years, I'm sure we will reach the point where you literally could fool the eye with
You
it.
talk about lunch, and then you talk about it as being passive.
Sorry?
And then you talk about it as being a passive.
cheap lunch.
Passive. You can't say that and say that it is passive.
Would we go to...
Well, I didn't. Yes, I mean, I don't mean to suggest it isn't powerful, and I think that if people, I mean, if people want to make, I mean, if there is a desire to make big changes in people's lives, I mean, if I take the example of commuting that's been mentioned, I mean, you know, one view of commuting is that everybody's actually very happy doing it, and that there are all kinds of reasons why they actually like to get away from their homes in Chingford or Bishop Stortford and go and have a day with a group of other people in the middle of the city. But I mean, you know, one scenario says, I mean, I'm just putting it to crude extremes, but I mean, one view of it would be to say, well, actually everybody enjoys doing it. Another view, the opposite extreme, would be to say everybody loathes it and they're just longing to live life a different way, if only they had the chance. Now, my view of, I mean, I'm not saying telecoms isn't extremely powerful, because I think that if there is some sort of fundamental force and desire to make a substantial change, then I think telecoms could be the enabler of that change, and to that extent it could be the absolutely vital factor and could be the key to substantial change. But I mean, I suppose the impression I have, of what it's worth, is that people do seem extraordinarily attached to their accustomed ways of doing things. I mean, even, you know, you think of a laborious, awful thing like a wife going to the supermarket to load up her trolley with a lot of groceries at Tesco's. And I mean, I've been thinking to myself, well, can't we just have a little box on the wall, and she just, for example, every time she takes something out of the cupboard, she just punches some buttons on the wall, and then once a week a box comes and replenishes her larder. But I think that the difficulty, I mean, that, you know, crudely you might think marvellous to liberate her from trundling around with the supermarket wagon. But I think, in fact, she does get all kinds of subordinate satisfactions. I'm trying to think what this is.
Taking single elements. I mean, again, it's interesting that those who are rich tend not to go to Tesco, but tend to pick up the telephone and phone Harrods. But that's because they can afford to, and because Harrods give a guarantee of a certain situation. But really, that isn't the question. The question is, the problem is, what other thing is there to do? In other words, if it's you and you're working all day, or it's your wife and she's working all day, then probably she'll pick up the telephone, and because she will well consider that work more important, or that enjoyment more important. So your communication systems allow you to have something more enjoyable. Given a choice between Tesco's and a fun place to go to, she might go to a fun place, or he might go to a fun place, and use that vehicle. If it's the right dreary old evening, then you might do any number of things which will get you out of that dreary old house. So there's a number of things which make that.
It's also just expensive to sort of pump a load of baked beans down a pipe from Tesco's to your house. I mean, it's a phenomenally expensive network, isn't it? I mean, it's far cheaper to do it by hand, you know, than it is to actually get. I mean, there isn't the technology, is there, to get...
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't meaning to suggest not calling the beans, but...
actually, that's
vacuum tubes.
Well,
Isn't that what Buzz is? Thanks for calling that one.
When you get a plan rejected, don't eat them.
I cannot resist responding.
I think with that thought of baked beans going down tubes, we've had Dr. Alex Reid talking now for exactly 2 hours, you know, and that's a hell of a start on it. And he's really done brilliantly. And there's a lot of lovely food there that he is. Am I going to come around and get a fiver off everybody who stays for food? So please, I hope you will, before you go, if you have to go early. Let me hand off 5 to help pay for food. And may I please thank Dr. Alex Reid very warmly for super evening, very stimulating, very unusual, full of vitality and interest. It stimulated a lot of marvellous discussion, which can go on now informally. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
You saying about this is what I should do. The most critical.